All right, 5:59, got a minute. Oh, straight up 6 right now. Very good. Oh, wait a minute. We got more time this evening. And I see we got 9 people, 10 people already joining us. That's good. Hello, Janice, Jasmine, Amanda, Lydia, Elizabeth, Abby, Nancy, Miguel, and Corina.
Hi.
Hi. Actually, since I wanted to give you all a couple minutes, we could take this time. I'll just field some questions that any of you might have before we get into our lesson today. So, what are the questions on your mind?
Can we review kind of what's expected of the essay, since we'll probably start working on it this week since it's submitted soon? We need to submit soon.
The signature assignment essay?
Yes.
Yeah, let me try to bring, I normally do that, I think, during week 5, but I could touch upon it today as well. I'll bring up the prompt and maybe briefly go over it with you. Then what I was hoping to do next week is like have a discussion about Philemon. That way you could kind of glean from one another's ideas, although you will be doing some exercises online where you could kind of interact with one another about the themes in Philemon and kind of help one another think through the issues. But yeah, that's a good idea. I will try to roll that in there and touch upon that this evening together. Anybody else?
I'll ask, have you started implementing any repercussions for late work? As I'm still trying.
Even though I said I would, but no, I haven't. So just keep.
Okay.
All right. Yeah, I'm still honestly getting caught up on my grading. I'm not where I want to be. So that works in your guys' favor. So as long as I'm in that catch-up mode myself, then I'm giving you guys grace. Is what it comes down to. Any other questions before I move on? 6:02. Okay, I'm going to bring up, here it is. Today's lesson, what I need to do is find it on the share. There we are. And boom, can you all see that full screen? Yeah, all right, fantastic. You should know by now, this is Biblical Perspectives. Tonight, we're going to be looking at prophecy and wisdom. That should not surprise you because you've been doing a bunch of prophecy and wisdom stuff in week 4 online. There's a few things I want to kind of emphasize in our time together, reinforce with the stuff that you've engaged in. And then I have an assignment particularly related to Amos 8, which I asked you guys to do some reading in that as well as look at the video. If you hadn't, slight bummer, but not a big deal. And if you have, kudos to you. You'll be just a little bit better prepared for what we're doing tonight. We are going to read Amos 8 together again for some of you and for the first time, perhaps for others. But before we do that, let's do a quick 3-week review. Let's get the bird's eye view of what's been going on. So the first week we got together, one of the things I did besides introducing the class is introducing the idea of story. I mentioned the fact that one component of this class, beyond biblical interpretation, is a biblical perspective on community. And I said that there's different aspects of community that we're going to be looking at. That first night, the first week, was story and community. And so let's look at these bullet points together very quickly. Story is the means by which people are given a sense of who they are and what is their purpose in life. So with respect to the scriptures in Genesis, we see that God created all there is by the power of his word, and all that he created was good. That includes you and me. We are good creatures of God. However, we also see that corruption entered into God's creation through sin. So even though we're good, we're blighted by sin. Sin is a reality that undermines or affects our goodness in some way. Amidst the aftermath of the fall, God calls a person, Abraham, and gives him a promise that becomes the foundation for God's plan to renew the world. And that promise basically is that through Abraham's seed, which most immediately is Israel, God's blessing would come to the world. Through Abraham's seed, Israel, God's blessing would come into the world. But then from a New Testament perspective, we see the seed of Abraham really as Jesus, who is the true Israelite, a true Moses, the real son of David, the genuine inheritor of the throne of Israel. And it's through Jesus that God's blessing is really going to come into the world. In Exodus, we see God's people, the children of Abraham, are enslaved in Egypt, and God raises up a deliverer, Moses, through whom God establishes a covenant with Israel. That is week one, community and story. And you want to get the overarching story of the scriptures. That's a part of biblical interpretation, to understand that there is an overarching story, beginning with creation, going to Abraham, Abraham's children, culminated in Jesus, and through Jesus doing all that he does to identify with humanity, going into death, being resurrected and ascended, and sending his spirit upon us. Now, the blessing of Abraham through Jesus Christ comes to the world. And really, that's the power of the Spirit to renew us morally, spiritually, in relationship with God. And eventually, Christians believe Jesus will come back and complete what he began when he came the first time. Now let's talk about week two, community and law. The context of the law is the covenant of God. And you all read about that, particularly when you were reading through Exodus, that God established so that his chosen people would be the means through which God would renew the world. In other words, if they abided by the covenant, God's blessing would be upon them. This blessing is rooted, as I just mentioned, in God's promise to Abraham. God's saving actions preceded the covenant and the giving of the law. So in your readings, you might have noticed that when the law was established at the heart of the covenant, it begins with a kind of preamble where it talks about how God is their deliverer, the one who delivered them from the land of slavery, from bondage in Egypt. So God first talks about his hand to deliver, which is a grace that he gives the people of Israel. And now that he's delivered them, he wants to establish this covenant relationship, at which the law is the heart. The law is the guideline within which God's people are called to live so that God's blessing may rest upon them. So I think it's perhaps easy, somewhat simplistic, but easy to think about it this way. You can't really exist under God's blessing if you don't live justly. Because if you don't live justly, then you're actually bringing harm into the world. And God cannot bless harm, is what it comes down to. So living under God's blessing means that God's people will flourish. They will prosper, body and soul. Every single one of us will have access to the resources that we need to become the people that God made us to be in our growth and development and becoming. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus deepened Israel's understanding of the law. We had a discussion together online about that. Jesus deepened Israel's understanding of the law by focusing on the heart. So it's not just what you do, but why you are doing it, what motivates you. The heart is really what matters. Jesus, as we could see in the reading together, the Sermon on the Mount, is presented as a new Moses. So just as Moses goes up the mountain to receive the law, to bring it to Israel, Jesus goes up a mountain to provide this sermon where he provides the definitive commentary on Moses's law. He is expressing to us through that sermon the nature of true righteousness. So again, Jesus is a new Moses whose authority exceeds that of Moses and all the prophets. Jesus said, "You have heard it was said, Moses and all the prophets, but I tell you," right? Now he's given the definitive interpretation of what all of that meant in the Old Testament. And then finally, a disciple of Jesus, Paul, the apostle, builds upon Jesus's work by showing how the law, which Jesus commented on, was meant to lead us to Christ, who would bring us into a new relationship with God by the Spirit that I just mentioned, who would lead us into a life of which the law is a witness. So really in the Bible, there's kind of a dichotomy. There's the Spirit and there's the law. And a lot of times in the Bible, the law is problematic when we attempt to live a righteous lifestyle in our own power and in our own strength. We were not made by God to live in our own power, in our own strength. We were made by God to live relying upon his gracious resources. To rely upon God's gracious resources, by the way, that's what the Bible means by faith. The just shall live by faith, right? So when the Bible says faith, you think trusting God and what he gives us freely through his Son. That's what faith basically means. And one of the key things that the Son gives us freely is the Spirit who renews us in our inward being. It's a slow process for most of us. Some people have like powerful, instantaneous, transformational conversion experiences where like, you know, they were evil and bad and jerks and whatever it is. And all of a sudden they're saints like overnight. That does happen, but it's not the norm. Most of us are slowly, patiently working out our salvation in submission to the Spirit's work in our life. Then the following week, which was our quick week last week, the week of my son's graduation, it went well, by the way. It was cool to hear one of you guys sent me a story about a graduation ceremony. I can't remember who it was, where a freak storm happened and the storm caused fireworks to rain down on the people during the graduation. That was you? That was awesome. That's so amazing. That is crazy.
Yeah.
We
It
had
was crazy.
fireworks too, but it didn't rain down on them.
Yeah, I had graduated with like some type of honors, and my last name starts with a T, and so I was luckily one of the first like 20 people called, because it was like a select group of students that were called first, and I was the last name called. And I take my diploma, and my principal kind of like runs up to the microphone, and she's like, "I'm so sorry, guys, but we're gonna have to like stop the graduation." And everybody kind of laughs, and they're like, "Haha," like, "What are you talking about?"
Yeah.
And within like 30 seconds, these black clouds just came in and just stormed.
Wow.
Like lightning hit trees and cars, and all these
Whoa.
poor old grandparents are like having trouble getting, oh my gosh, it was crazy.
That's so funny. And this is in June, right?
Hanford.
Yeah, that's so crazy. But that does happen every now in the valley, freak thunderstorms. Okay, cool. That was good to hear. Community and leadership. So speaking of graduation, right, you get an education that actually often puts people in a position of leadership. So it's fitting because you all are pursuing degrees. And even if you're not officially the boss, you will have people around you that you are providing leadership for. So this connects with you. Leaders are those who understand the stories that shape a community. So that's one thing I think that's really critical. To be an effective leader is to tell the stories of a community well, because within those stories is the purpose and the mission for why you are a community, what that community is about. So to become a master of the stories is going to inform the kind of policies that you are creating, the direction of the community that you are part of, whether we're talking a community as church or a community as business. All of that stuff applies. Leaders create, interpret, uphold, and apply the laws, policies, and norms of a community. So as I was just indicating, there's a reciprocal relationship between the stories and the kind of laws that are created, because those laws are helping a community order itself, which is something that we explored. And we need that order so that there's function, and that function helps the mission and direction of the community. Not all leaders do all of these actions with respect to the law, but generally some have some responsibility regarding laws and policies. From a biblical perspective, leaders are called to be servants who lead through example, who lead through obedience to God's will. And so in the Old Testament, I kind of wheedled this down into a formula or slogan. As the king goes, so goes Israel. If there's a righteous king on the throne, then that king will lead Israel into righteousness. And if there's a corrupt king on the throne, then that leader will lead Israel into corruption, injustice, and oppression. And by the way, that kind of applies to any nation and any culture. If you have good leaders, good politicians, for example, that are in the halls of power, then that will hasten justice. Even in the United States, that's a democracy. Leaders can have a profound influence. So just something to keep in mind. All right, now we're up to week 4. And today we will be looking at prophetic and wisdom literature, which are voices that help us navigate the challenges and pitfalls of living in community and life in general. I think these voices of wisdom and the voices of the prophets are really important, particularly during confusing times. And I don't know about you, but I experienced the world around us, and particularly in the United States, beginning back in 2020, but even before then. But the pandemic really hastened this, right? As a period of confusion, you know, because very quickly managing the pandemic became a political ordeal, and people were lining themselves up on the right and on the left, so to speak. And we would hear different things like, you know, masks are effective, no, masks are not effective. the pandemic is going to kill this many percentage of people. No, it's going to kill this many percentage of people. Revision, it's going to kill this many percentage of people. Okay, we thought it was going to be like this, but now we know it's going to be like this. Okay, what I just said a few moments ago, I take that back. It's actually going to be like this. And all these different news sources were conflicting with one another. And we're like, okay, do I stay home or can I go out? What can I do? Would you guys just settle it? You know, that kind of stuff. That's what it felt like. And then, you know, again, everyone's politicizing this. And so they're using it to gain more political power and a stronger voice in the media and gain greater influence and all that kind of stuff. And you begin to wonder, do people want to search for the truth or do they want power and all that kind of stuff? And it's confusion. And that's when you want people who have wisdom to speak into the confusion. And you want a prophetic voice, the voice from God's perspective to speak into the confusion and provide some clarity regarding how we're going to best conduct ourselves and relate to one another to bring genuine flourishing into the culture in which we live. That's what prophecy and wisdom are all about. So with that foundation laid, I want to start presenting to you a series of images, okay? And you will notice that there's some commonalities among these diverse images. So let me switch over to do that. I have to pull up another PowerPoint program. Where is my toolbar? Oh, I know what I need to do. All right, here we go. Stop share, share new screen. Let me see where you at. Come into this. And it's this one. Here we are. Hey, you guys disappeared. What happened to you? Okay, I guess I didn't do that right. Hold on. Bam, there you are. Now I know I got it right. Now let me do this. Oh my goodness, come on now. I know what I need to do. Get out of here. And now, y'all can see this full screen?
Yes.
Yes? Yeah, okay, good, thank you. Yeah. Some of your gestures were really subtle. Like, it was like your heads were doing kind of like, is that a yes or a no? What is, when your head's like bobbing that way? What? I'm not sure what you're saying to me. Okay, good. But now I know it's a yes. What is prophecy? What is wisdom? They're similar. They're not the same. That's what we're going to explore tonight. Consider the following images. All right, there we go. Looks like some old dude from the Bible, right? He's got a long white beard, flowy robes, got a headpiece, protect himself against the sun, although it's cloudy right now. And another dude wearing flowy robes, got a beard. You might have guessed that this is supposed to be a rendering of Moses. How can you tell? Because he has the commandments in his arm. Now here's another guy. Robes, long beard. He's writing in a scroll. My guess is he's some kind of prophet. Perhaps Isaiah, but I don't know for sure. Now we're moving out of the domain of the Bible and we're going into the larger world. This right here, I believe, is Aristotle. No, I believe that's Plato. Pardon me. An artist's imagination, imagining what Plato would have looked like. That, I believe, is Aristotle right there. So if that's not familiar names to you, those are two Greek philosophers that lived about 500 years before the time of Christ, 400 years, somewhere in there. And now I'm going into the domain of fantasy and fiction. And that right there is from Harry Potter, Dumbledore. That's it. But you know, when I first saw that, I was thinking Gandalf, right? Because don't they look really familiar? Lord of the Rings, but that's actually from Harry Potter. Now there's Gandalf, right? Let me back up. Bam, Dumbledore, Gandalf, Dumbledore, Gandalf. You'd almost think it's the same actor. It wasn't. Although this guy was replaced sometime between the first movie and the last movie, FYI, if you want to geek out on this kind of stuff. But you will notice definitely a similarity between them. Super long beard, really white hair. Like he looks like an old rocker on some level, right? Like ZZ Top. He could have been in a band or something like that with that kind of hair, or a Viking. Anyways, going forward now, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, this is Ben Kenobi from the original Star Wars, played by Sir Alec Guinness, who looks a lot like the other two actors that played the previous two wizards that we looked at. And you could call Ben Kenobi, who is a Jedi, a kind of wizard. And also the motif continues, right? You notice the white hair, see the beard. What do these images have in common? I gave you some of it, but see if you could add.
They all have wisdom.
Okay. Why do you think they have wisdom though? Why would you say that?
Because they're smart and they're the ones that were like, I don't know any of the movies you guys that were on there, but I'm assuming that they were like leaders and they
Okay. All right.
and like for the prophets,
Yeah.
you know, taught people how to like to live and guided them
Right.
through life and stuff.
Good. Okay. So definitely the prophets are kind of in a unique category because they received the word of God. So you could imagine God being above it all and having a God's eye perspective, they say, as far as what's going on in the world. And because they have access to the word of God, they can give that knowledge and perspective to those of us who are down here. So that definitely works for the prophets, right? Abraham was a kind of prophet. Moses, definitely a prophet. That third guy that we saw, I think was Isaiah, definitely a prophet. But then we got into, like I said, Aristotle and Plato, those are philosophers. And then I wrapped up with some wizards, right? And yet, even though we have prophets and wizards and philosophers, I still think there's a commonality, right? And it's true. Intelligence is kind of one of the things you said. What would lead you, there's other reasons why we might think that they're wise. I think I have another question here. Let's look at this. Okay, let me back up. Yeah. What else would lead you to think that these men have wisdom or intelligence or understanding?
They're older.
Yeah. Now, what's the correlation? You're right, Janice, but what is the connection?
Experience, life experience.
There we go. That's one of the factors as far as gleaning wisdom is concerned. You have to have some experience. Now, just because you're old doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be wise, because you've heard the term old fool, right? But I think you can't really be wise without some experience, without some years, without some age under your belt, so to speak. There has to be other factors if that age is going to convert into wisdom. But age is a part of it, right? That's not to say that young people can't be wise. They can. And particularly among their peers, there's people among your peers that are unusually wise. Often you'll meet them. An old soul, as they say, right? But anyways, all of these men are icons of wisdom. They are mentors, teachers, and leaders. Why do we associate wisdom with aged men who typically have light hair and beards? You just said it a few moments ago. The age, that connection between age and experience, and somehow experience being a critical ingredient of being wisdom. Now, I want you to look at this. Old men with beards, typically presented as icons of wisdom in our culture. I'm going to try to subvert that just a little bit. Wisdom cries out in the streets. In the squares, she raises her voice. At the busiest corner, she cries out. At the entrance of the city gates, she speaks. How long, O simple ones, will you love being simple? How long will scoffers delight in their scoffing and fools hate knowledge? Give heed to my reproof. I will pour out my thoughts to you. I will make my words known to you. Continuing. Does not wisdom call? Does not understanding raise her voice? The Lord created me at the beginning of his works, the first of his acts long ago. Ages ago, I was set up at the first before the beginning of the earth, when there were no depths. Now, I want you to think about the creation narrative that we read the first week. When there were no depths, I was brought forth. When there were no springs abounding with water, before the mountains had been shaped, before the hills, I was brought forth. When he, God, had not yet made earth and fields, or the world's first bits of soil. When he, God, established the heavens, she, was there. When he drew a circle on the face of the deep, when he made firm the skies above, when he established the fountains of the deep, when he, God, assigned to the sea limit, so that the waters might not transgress his command. Oh man, I need to juice up here. Hold on one second. Transgress his command, when he marked out the foundations of the earth, then I was beside him like a master worker. I was daily his delight, rejoicing before him always, rejoicing in his inhabited world, and delighting in the human race. But let me remind you, at the very beginning, it says, does not understanding raise her voice, right? So now we're getting a little bit of the feminine in here. Keep this in mind, these images. That is an icon, and that icon is called Sophia. And Sophia is a name, but it's also the Greek word for wisdom. That, I believe, is Minerva, a Greek god, and she is the god of learning and wisdom. That right there is Anna. She was a lady that prayed day and night in the temple waiting for the Messiah. And she was the one that intuited when Joseph and Mary brought Jesus into the temple for circumcision. She intuited in her spirit that that baby was the coming Messiah, right? So a holy woman with unusual insight. That is Miriam, the sister of Moses, who after God acted by drowning the Israelite army in the Red Sea, she led Israel in a time of worship and praise over what God had done. And during that time, as she's leading people and dancing and whatnot, she begins prophesying and speaking of the glory of the Lord, right? So she's a prophet. Why do you think wisdom is often portrayed as a woman? So here's a contrast here, right? Because before we had old men with beards, they lived a long time. We understand why they're presented as icons of wisdom. Why women? Why are women presented as icons of wisdom?
Because we're just smart.
Better DNA. All right, there we go. I knew somebody had to get that in. Okay, I'll accept that, but let's elaborate a little bit more.
Does it have to do with us having children?
Oh, good. I like that. Elaborate, though.
I don't know.
You know what you just demonstrated, Janice? You actually demonstrated what I think. I'm going to perhaps short circuit this conversation a little bit, but I want to run with what you said, Janice. You just threw out there, is it because we have children, right? But you couldn't quite articulate why. What you just expressed to me is that you intuited the answer without fully understanding it. You were living by intuition. In other words, you were responding by intuition. I think our wisdom is rooted in the fact that we have kids, but you couldn't quite explain why that's the case, right? And I think on some level, that's a feminine way of knowing. Not that men can't be intuitive, they can. In fact, I think I'm a deeply intuitive male. Compared, to most of my male compadres, I'm unusually intuitive. Men can be intuitive, right? So I don't want to put men and women in boxes. I do not want to do that. But I also want to acknowledge that there are certain characteristics that are commonly feminine and certain characteristics that are commonly masculine, right? And I think intuition is a commonly feminine intuition. And I think that's connected to the fact that women have children because they bring forth life in their body. They're connected deeply to life in their very body. Men don't have that experience. They don't have that capacity, right? They don't have the cycle of life in their own body. Men often have to learn wisdom by going out into the world and having the world knock them down. That, hard knocks, as they say, right? They have to come up against their limitations. They have to come up against their ego and have it broken in some way to become more relational and less egoistic. And again, I'm speaking in stereotypes, but this is a common male story, right? Whereas women, I think they're automatically relational because they have the capacity to bear life within themselves. So within themselves, they're already relational. And I think intuition is deeply relational. It's relational knowledge, right? And then you've heard like brain studies, how women have more, the connective tissue across the hemispheres that give them more holistic thinking, where guys tend to switch back and forth between right brain and left brain and all that kind of stuff. I don't know how much that still sounds psychology and neurobiology and all that kind of stuff. But that was the stereotype at one time. And so I bring this up because I think wisdom has this other component, a kind of intuitive dimension, a knowing that's really relational and deeply connected, as opposed to stepping out and analyzing, right? That's another type of knowledge. To be outside of something, trying to observe it objectively and try to seek patterns and rationally identify those patterns. That's one way of knowing. The other way of knowing is that deep, intuitive, relational connecting, right? And that's why I think men and women often present different icons of wisdom, because wisdom entails both of those in some way, shape, or form. So I want to skip over that one because we're not together 4 hours tonight, just 2. And so I have to do some editing as we go along. Let us switch. Here we go. I'm going to bring this one up now. Here we go. So let's talk about prophets. Any questions, by the way, before we go forward? We're good? All right. We're going to begin talking about prophets, then we'll wrap up talking about wisdom. The office of prophet received its normative nature through Moses. So remember, Moses is the lawgiver in the overarching story of Israel after Israel was delivered from Egypt, the land of slavery, under the ministry of Moses. So Moses was not just a lawgiver, he was a deliverer and lawgiver, the one who established the covenant. Moses became a standard of sorts for future prophets. He was the key figure in establishing God's covenant with Israel and in giving the law. So that's the reason why he's at the foundation of all prophetic ministry, because he gave the law, and the prophets were primarily concerned about Israel keeping the covenant and being Torah observant. That's the primary ministry of a prophet. A prophet is one who receives his calling from God and cannot become a prophet of his own initiative. So it's not like, when I was 18, graduating from high school, hey, Anthony, what do you want to be when you grow up? I think I want to go off to prophet school and be a prophet. That's not how it works, okay? You could study prophecy as a kind of literature, but that doesn't make you a prophet in the biblical sense of the word, where there's some kind of encounter and confrontation with God, which creates a kind of empowerment and anointing that then sets that person into the ministry of prophet. Often in prophetic literature, there will be a call narrative that serves to validate the prophet's ministry. We're not going to look at that together tonight. There's an example in Isaiah 6. This calling entails standing in the presence of God to receive his counsel. So they're receiving the words of God directly from God. What we see in Isaiah, so I can't remember if we assigned this to you. I think we did. What you see in Isaiah is that there are 2 aspects present in the prophetic ministry. It's the vision and the word, the vision and the word. So Isaiah had a vision from God of God in his temple. He saw God in God's holiness in his temple. The result of that was that Isaiah became intensely aware of his brokenness. He became intensely aware of his sinfulness, right? And I bet you Isaiah was probably a pretty just guy in all of Israel, right? Compared to other Israelites, Isaiah was probably a pretty good person. But compared to the holiness of God, he could just say, I am a man of unclean lips who lives among unclean people. The contrast is overwhelming for him. And then what happened is his angel took a coal from the altar in heaven and touched Isaiah's lips with it, and it purged him of his sins. He had a sense of forgiveness, his trespasses being set aside, and that equipped him to be in God's presence. Then, after that experience, Isaiah was commissioned by God to speak to God's people. So it's the vision and the commission to speak God's word. Bam. Yeah, that's what I just shared with you a moment ago. Then one of the seraphim, so I'm quoting scripture right here. Then one of the seraphim flew to me with a live coal in his hand, which he had taken from tongs from the altar. With it, he touched my mouth and said, see, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away and your sin is atoned for. This, by the way, is like an Old Testament foreshadowing of the ministry of Jesus. It's kind of cool that way. An Old Testament foreshadowing of the ministry of Jesus. So when we talk about prophets, there's some key terms, 2 of them particularly in Hebrew. There is Nabi and Ro'eh. Nabi and Ro'eh. Nabi is commonly translated as speaker or spokesperson. So what that means is the prophet is a spokesperson for God. And actually there's imagery in the scriptures where it talked about the prophet could feel the word of God bubbling up within their heart, within their bosom, within their soul. It was so overwhelming that it just like they had to speak it. They couldn't contain it within themselves. They had to speak it out. So the Spirit was working upon them to give utterance to God's word. The word ro'eh is translated as seer. The seer sees the vision of God and sees things typically not seen. So for example, prophets will often see angels that the other people don't see, right? Or they'll see demonic realities. They'll see oppression in the spiritual realm. They'll see the glory of God that other people miss. And so prophets are able to see things in the spiritual domain that we often overlook. It's a vision, a gift, that God has given them, that kind of sight. Prophetic utterance in Hebrew literally means burden of the Lord and refers to the power of the Spirit coming upon the prophet. And this oracle, this prophecy, is a visionary, poetic, and symbolic in expression. Typically, if you were to look at prophetic literature, it's not an easy read. It's sometimes beautiful, sometimes a lot of wordplay, which is interesting, sometimes very visual, deeply symbolic, and for us particularly, a little confusing, right? What is this guy saying, right? Moreover, prophetic utterance can be textured with multiple meanings. So like textured, like here's one layer, here's another layer, here's another layer. That's what I mean by texture, right? And prophetic utterance often works like that. So often with one meaning being immediate to the present circumstances of the prophet. In other words, what the prophet is saying applies to his day and age, but then there is something in what he said that applies to a future generation as well. So that's what I mean by like double entendre almost. Now and later, now and later. The same word, now and later. And so for that reason, I like to use this image right here of mountains to kind of be a symbol of prophetic utterance. I'll explain that. I kind of do beneath it. Prophetic literature has an immediate linear dimension as well as a depth and height dimension to its meaning. In other words, with respect to the linear dimension, y'all can see my cursor, that arrow right there. You could read prophetic utterance like left to right, like we do text, right? You could just read it in an orderly fashion straight across. But when you read it that way, like this, from peak to peak to peak to peak, what you're overlooking is that some of these peaks are closer to us than other peaks. Some of the peaks are farther away, right? And I think prophetic literature often works that way with respect to time. It has an immediate application, and then it has a deeper peak later on. And that's why it gets really confusing. Did that come to pass? Are we expecting that to happen in the future? And people argue, right? But I think that's the nature of poetic literature. And I think a part of that is because God is eternal and he's not in time, the way we are in time. And so his God's eye view sees things differently. In the scriptures itself, that says that 1,000 years for us is like one day to God, you know? So just something to think about. So earlier I was talking about how Moses set the foundation of the prophetic ministry. This is one of the things I want to confront. A lot of times when we think of prophets, we get them confused with fortune tellers. It's not the same thing, right? Because we think prophets are all about revealing the future. That's what prophets do. They reveal the future, right? No, that's just a byproduct of what's central to their ministry. Telling the future is not central to a prophetic ministry. It's just a byproduct. It might happen sometimes. Let me explain. This is what's at the heart of the prophetic ministry, God's covenant and the law. The prophet is a person that's obsessed with the covenant and law and calling Israel to be faithful to God's covenant. Prophets remind Israel of God's faithfulness and calling to be God's people for the world, that they are the children of Abraham, Abraham who received a promise from God that through Abraham's seed, God's blessing would come to the world. The prophets would remind Israel of that promise. Law-keeping brings shalom. That word means peace. Often when we think of peace, we think of absence of war, but that's not what the Bible means by peace. They mean something more positive, more substantial, more comprehensive. What shalom is essentially all the conditions, the just, righteous conditions being in place so that humans can flourish, so that there is no poverty, so that everyone receives the education that they need to receive, so that they can receive the resources they need in order to become the people that God wants them to be. That's shalom. That's true peace. And so Israel's purpose was to bring God's blessing to the nations, God's shalom to the nations. That was their mission. And the prophets wanted to make sure that Israel stayed focused on their calling and mission, which was expressed in the covenant and the law. All right. Okay, Anthony, that's great. But we started reading, you all are reading the Bible, and you're getting very familiar with the fact that Israel often does not keep the law, right? Okay, you're aware of that. So that brings up the second part of the prophetic ministry, judgment and renewal. Judgment and renewal. So infidelity brings judgment. And the prophets then go confront the powers that be and basically say, if you don't repent, judgment's going to come upon you. Count your days. You better start repenting, because if you don't repent, God's judgment is coming. It's coming even now. In fact, it's at hand, right? So law breaking has consequences, but the consequences, the judgment is not the final word. Hallelujah, right? After the judgment, there is hope for renewal. And I think this is true in our lives, because I don't know if any of you have ever had the experience of being spanked by God, right? Disciplined by God. Where often you've done something bad or stupid or, selfish choice or whatever it is, and you face the consequences of that. And it's not like, oh, I hate you, right? God's not doing that to you. He loves you, but he wants to discipline you and shape your character, and he'll use negative consequences to get your attention, to bring you back into a relationship with him, and to bring you into conformity to the image of Christ, which is love and service and self-giving, right? So God, when he judges you, doesn't leave you in the state of judgment. It's kind of like a spanking to get your attention and put you right on the right path. After judgment comes redemption. So we see this in the biblical story when Israel, because of their infidelity and their sin, they broke into two nations, Judah in the south and Israel in the north. They became two nations. Under King David, they were one nation. After King David, there were two nations. And neither of those nations followed God. Judah did a little bit better than Israel, but neither of them on the whole did very well. So as a result of that, God raised up prophets to warn both these nations, the Israelites, that judgment was coming. The northern kingdom was more stubborn and more obstinate, and God allowed the Syrians to drag them away about 700 years before the time of Christ. An Assyrian army came along, decimated Israel, and I think it was Damascus, the capital of Israel, and dragged the Israelites into exile, into their land, to be their servants and to be their slaves and that kind of stuff. And then there was just Judah. And Judah stayed around for about another 150 years. But they too were not faithful to God. And God raised up prophets and warned Judah, and Judah didn't heed. And then finally, Babylon came along and dragged Judah away.
So
all of
I had a question. So Judah was its own tribe, and then all the 11 were.
Oh, it was two. There was two tribes that were a part of Judah. It was Judah and another tribe, and I can't remember the name of it right now. Sorry about that. So it was two that were associated with Judah, and then the other 10 were associated with Israel. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I could probably look that up for you real quick. But yeah, 2 and 10.
The bigger group, the group that had the 10,
yeah,
they still their own little tribes in one? Like, were they divided too? Like, I know they were.
Right.
Oh, good.
I get what you're saying. So they would still say within the nation of Israel, let's use nation for right now, right? The nation of Israel and the nation of Judah. Let's use that language right now, okay? In the nation of Israel, there were 10 Israelite tribes.
Yeah.
In the nation of Judah, there were 2 Israelite tribes. So within those nations, they were aware of the tribes, and they tried to maintain the tribal distinctions because who your father was really mattered a lot with respect to inheritance rights. So they maintained that kind of consciousness.
So, but were they united as one, or there's a lot of chaos and everyone's still?
There was, let's say, you know how America's kind of divided?
Yeah.
But if a foreigner came and invaded us, a lot of our divisions would be overcome really quickly for the sake of fighting those foreigners. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to particularly in light of the fact that Asians have been persecuted in our culture recently. You've seen the flare up of that. I don't want to, but just say if China invaded us for whatever reason, I don't think they are. I'm just trying to give you an example.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, Republicans and Democrats would get in line with one another to fight against China's invasion. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So even though we're divided, it's possible for us politically to bind together for protection. That's what it would be like in Israel or like in Judah.
Okay. All right. I misunderstood when I was reading. I thought that the whole group was just like everyone. I thought everyone was divided up, like chaos, craziness.
But beneath the surface of that national unity, there was a lot of that chaos and brokenness, right? And actually having a king, a just king, was how that was supposed to be overcome. But the kings were not just, and so it wasn't overcome, right? And actually in the era, now I'm going back to the overarching narrative of scripture, in the era before the kings was the era of the judges, when you just had the 12 tribes. There was not a nation, just the 12 tribes of Israel who had come into the promised land. And they were not officially a nation in that sense because they didn't have a king. Although God wanted them to be a nation under him, like a theocracy, right? But it never happened. So they became very tribal. That was a very chaotic and broken time. And the king, for a little period of time under Saul, brought national unity. And then when David was at his best, there was a strong nation under David. But then David sinned with Bathsheba, as we learned about, and that created civil war beginning in his house that then broke out into the rest of the nation. So David's sin actually broke the nation because people began to distrust David's leadership as a result of that. So leadership really matters. And you're right. So there is that chaos underneath the surface. It's there. That's a good reading. So the final bullet point I have is, okay, I just talked about how the northern kingdom was dragged away and the southern kingdom was dragged away. Now they're in exile. During the time of exile, God raised up prophets to let Israel know, I have not forgotten you, my people in exile, and I will bring you home, right? And indeed, a large portion of Israelites did come back to the homeland eventually. And it's established at the time that Jesus comes and hits the scene. So the good news is, the last bullet point, God will not give up on his people. He will restore them, right? And so judgment is kind of a chastening. It's for a season, for a period, to bring us back home to his heart. We're not going to look at Amos. I was hoping you would do that on your own. Now we're going to do this Amos assignment. We're going to review chapter 8 together. So in order to do that, I need to get out of here and stop the share. And I'm going to go to a new web page. Cool picture. Here we go. Hold on. Here we go. Let me do a new share real quick and bring this up to you all. All right, here we are. I'll start this one and I'll ask for a couple volunteers. This is what the sovereign Lord showed me. A basket of ripe fruit. What do you see, Amos? So Amos is having that visionary experience that I told you about, right? FYI, just in case you didn't read it or look at the video yet, Amos was raised up as a prophet during the time that Israel was divided into two nations, Judah and Israel. And Amos was called particularly to preach to Israel, the northern kingdom, okay? So he's preaching to the northern kingdom. Again, let me go back. This is what the sovereign Lord showed me, Amos, a basket of ripe fruit. What do you see, Amos? The Lord asked. A basket of ripe fruit, I answered. Then the Lord said to me, the time is ripe for my people Israel. I will spare them no longer. The time of warning is over, in other words. In that day, declares the Lord, the sovereign Lord, the songs in the temple will turn to wailing. Many, many bodies flung everywhere, silence. Hang on to that word, silence. Hear this, you who trample the needy and do away with the poor of the land, saying, when will the new moon be over, that we may sell grain, and the Sabbath be ended, that we may market wheat, skimping on the measure, boosting the price, and cheating with dishonest scales, buying the poor with silver and the needy for a pair of sandals, selling even the sweepings with the wheat. Okay, somebody take verse 7 through 10, please.
So the Lord has sworn by himself, the pride of Jacob, I will never forget anything you have done. Will not the land tremble for this, and all who live in it mourn? The whole land will rise like the Nile. It will be stirred up and then sink, like the river, like the river of Egypt. And that day declares the sovereign Lord, I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight. I will turn your religious festivals into mourning and all of your singing into weeping. I will make all of you wear sackcloth and shave your heads, and I will make the time like mourning for an only son, and the day of it like a bitter day.
Good.
Keep going.
One thing I want to point out before we go forward, and then it sounded like you had a question. You see that part that says, I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight? And in at least 3 of the Gospels, I think Matthew, Mark, and Luke, when they're narrating the crucifixion of Jesus, they make mention of the fact that the sun went down, right, at noon, that it was dark during the day. And I think the gospel writers are purposely evoking these words from Amos, saying, yes, that came to pass in their time, but it's also coming to pass here in our eyes in our time as well. So that's what I mean by the textured expression of prophecy. It worked in their day, but it also worked in Jesus's day. There was a depth dimension going on. Okay, somebody was going to say something, I think. No? Okay, cool. No problem. Okay, 11 through 14. Who's going to take the last third?
I
I'll
can
go.
go. Oh, go ahead.
Okay, 11 through 14. Okay.
Please.
The days are coming, declares the sovereign Lord, when I will send a famine through the land, not a famine of food or a thirst for water, but a famine of hearing the words of the Lord. People will stagger from sea to sea and wander from north to east, searching for the word of the Lord, but they will not find it. In that day, the lovely young women and strong young men will faint because of thirst. Those who swear by the sin of Samaria, who say, as surely as your God lives, Dan, or as surely as the God of Bathsheba lives, they will fall, never to rise again.
Whew, harsh. Okay. Pretty harsh, sobering words from God. Now what I want to do is we're going to go back into the program here. So I need to reshare for the presentation. Bam. Now what I want you to do is what we just read. In what we just read, there were words or phrases that evoke concepts that point to the world behind the text. So let me remind you regarding biblical interpretation. There's the text itself, which is the words on the page, right? The story that we're reading in the Bible, that's the text itself. That's the literary dimension of the Bible. But let's not forget that the Bible was written by authors who lived in a particular time and place. And those authors often made assumptions that you would know things that you don't know because you lived 2,000 years later or more, right? And so what you want to do when you're reading the literary dimension of the text is look at how the story, the literary dimension, points to the world behind the text through elements in the story, right? That raises questions to you, okay? So these features are words or phrases that evoke concepts that point to the world behind the text. In other words, when the text refers to institutions that you're not familiar with, when the text refers to socioeconomic practices that you're not familiar with, because it's different than our culture. When it talks about cultural practices, like one of our cultural practices is we drive on the right side of the road, right? It's also a law, but it's also a cultural practice. Well, they didn't have laws like that, but they had their own laws that govern movement, right? That's a cultural practice, for example. Beliefs. We share some of their beliefs, but we have different beliefs. And the author who's writing the story assumes that you know a lot of this stuff because he's envisioning an audience that's similar to himself. But we are not of that original audience, we're of a later audience. So we want to try to read the story and look for things that point to the world behind the text so that we could ask questions. Oh, I wonder what this means. I wonder if I could do some research to find out more about that. That's part of the skill of becoming a better reader of scripture. So what I want you to do now is go back with me to what we just read and try to identify features. If you need to, pull up your own Bible, go to Amos 8, pull up your phone, right? And go to Bible Gateway and read it here. Or you could also follow me back to this. I'm going to bring it up on our screen to share with one another. So I'll give you one as an example, and then you try to find a couple of other ones. When will the new moon be over? What is that? What is that referring to? Do we know anything about the new moon? I mean, you know, as far as lunar cycles are concerned, we might be familiar with the new moon and the full moon, right? But notice how it's capitalized as if it's an event that has particular meaning in their culture. That's what you would need to look up. What does that mean? When will the new moon be over? And why is selling grain attached to the new moon? Those are good historical questions. That's using elements in the literary dimension of the text to raise questions about the historical dimension of the text that then invites research. That's the skill, right? So somebody else point to something else in there that invites inquiry.
Well, we would need to know about Sabbath.
Good. Yes. It would be good to do research on the Sabbath so you can understand the significance of the Sabbath. What were the practices of the Sabbath, the norms, the customs of Sabbath? What were they? It would help you better understand this passage. Anything else come to mind?
Would we need to know how like their currency worked, like their money and stuff?
That could be helpful. Yeah. Because notice right here, it talks about skimping on the measure. That's an economic reference right there. Usually when I think of measure, I think of getting out a ruler, right? And like how long is something, or getting out a scale, how much does something weigh? And I don't typically think of those as economic realities, but often it was for them, right? They had to weigh their gold or whatever medium of exchange they used. So yes, that's good. Anything else stand out?
You would need to know the relationship between God and Jacob,
Why do you say
right?
that? I agree with you. Why do you say that?
Because it says the Lord has shown by the pride of Jacob.
There we go. What does that mean? That's a great question. So we know, if you're familiar with the Bible story, you would know that Jacob is the grandson of Abraham, right? Because it goes Abraham, Isaac, then Jacob. So Jacob is the third generation from the promise, right? And if you were really paying attention, you would know that Jacob is the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. So that's significant, right? It's Jacob that, even though Abraham in the ultimate sense is the father of Israel, in the most immediate sense, it's Jacob that's immediately the father of the 12 tribes. He had 12 sons who became the 12 tribes of Israel, right? So at least this, using the word Jacob here probably is just a symbolic way of referring to Israel as a whole. It could be that, right? But it also, because it says pride in capital, pride of Jacob, it sounds like a phrase that they were used to saying in that day, the pride of Jacob, the pride of Jacob. So we would have to research, what does that phrase, that idiom mean, pride of Jacob? What did it specifically mean in their culture? It could just be, one of the things that I think of is, you know how children are the pride of their parents? So it could be that they're referring to the children of Jacob, which it would then just be another way of saying Israel. But again, I'm kind of giving you an educated guess on the basis of research I've done in the past. I've honestly never looked up that word, pride of Jacob, to see what it specifically means. So that's a good one. Anything else stand out in this passage that merits some research? You guys are doing good, by the way. Change your mind? Somebody's going to say something. Somebody take a guess. One more, and then we'll move on.
At the end, it talks about what, Samaria or whatever.
Yeah, where is that? I remember that. Yeah,
It's
those
14.
swear by the sin of Samaria. Very good. There's a couple of things in there. So that I know Samaria was a part of Israel in northern kingdom, in the north. What the sin of Samaria is particularly, I'm not sure. Although actually, if I had a better memory, because I've read the whole of Amos before, it might have been articulated earlier in the book of Amos. But it also might have just been cultural knowledge. So it might not have been articulated in the book of Amos. Just the author would expect a good Jew to know, like current events. You know what I'm saying? They refer to it as the sin of Samaria. Oh, I remember that event that happened there. You know, like in the modern world, in spring of 2020, we had that event in Minnesota where a cop kills a black man, George Floyd, right? And we might have referred to that as the sin of Minnesota because of that particular event. So likewise, there might have been a particular event at that time that happened in Samaria that on some level is indicative of the brokenness of Israel as a whole, right? But I'm speculating, right? But you could do research to find out about that. So that's all this is about, is just like looking at those points in the literary dimension of the text that point to the historical world beyond it, that invite inquiry, that invite research. You could do the same thing for as surely as the God of Beersheba lives. That's weird. That's not a common way to refer to Yahweh. And I'm not even sure it does, but I think it does. But it's confusing to me that God is lowercase. Why would they make God lowercase if they're talking about Yahweh of Israel?
Is it her, like, wait, who is that? That's not the one that David sinned with, was it?
That's
Is that-
Bathsheba. Good question.
Okay.
That's Bathsheba. Very
So
simple,
this,
right.
so this is probably one of those foreign wives that brought her false gods.
Ooh, that might be it. That's a good guess. Even if you're not right, Lydia, I think that's a fantastic guess, because that's the kind of things you want to do. That to me would be like making a biblical hypothesis, and then you would actually check it out through historical research by the people who went and did the archaeological digs and looked up the old historic records to see if they could find somebody back in the day that explained that stuff, right? But anyways,
Mine doesn't say that. Like this one says in their class book or class
Yeah.
Bible, it says, "As your God lives, O Dan, and as the way of Beersheba lives, they
The
shall
way of-
fall and never rise again." So it's a little bit different.
as the way. Interesting. Now if I was to preach a sermon on that, I would actually go look that up. That's so curious to me that the authors who were looking at the original Hebrew that this was written in, or Aramaic, right? And the word there was of such a meaning that it could go both ways. It could either be interpreted as lowercase God or as way. And I would want to find out why that option is there, because that to me would shed deeper light on the meaning of what's going on there. And that would be a part of my sermon, explaining that, if you will. So I'm glad you shared that with us. All of that we just did together. I mean, not just me, what I was giving you, what you were giving to me, and the kind of questions you raised, what we did together, that's a part of biblical interpretation, right? That's getting into the historical dimension of the text, raising questions for further inquiry. That's part of biblical interpretation. Again, that's how we get into the historical dimension of the text. Okay, let me do a stop sharing this one. And now I want to take you back to the presentation, and I'm going to save from the current slide. Yeah, there we go. Sweet. Basket of right fruit. Let's look at these questions. We already did the, we did that in the other one. So we're going to begin with these right here. Identify examples of imagery and figurative language. So I gave you a sheet that talks about the literary dimension, and I talked a little bit about similes and metaphors. You guys remember similes and metaphors? Like my dad is an angry bear in the morning, that's a metaphor. My dad is like an angry bear in the morning, that's a simile, right? So now you're gonna have to use, I don't wanna keep switching back and forth, that's gonna be a hassle. Pull out your own Bibles or your own screens and look at that text. I'm going to do the same on my, oh man. Okay, there we go. I saw my image froze for a moment there. I'm going to look this up in my own phone, Amos 8. Read through it real quick and see if you can find an example of imagery or figurative language. There's an obvious one at the beginning, I think. A metaphor, an image.
Oh, are we sharing now or?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh.
Sorry, the floor is open.
Basket of fruit.
Yes,
The
yes.
first one.
Thank you. That's an image. And notice that, doesn't it say a basket of ripe fruit or summer fruit? Summer or ripe fruit, depending on the translation.
But I mean, unless I'm not getting it right, like the whole thing is like a metaphor to something, right?
It's an
Like
extended
everything
metaphor. Yeah. When you have an extended metaphor, I think usually those are called analogies. An extended metaphor in literary form is called an analogy. Yeah. So the whole thing is an analogy, an extended metaphor. That's true.
I don't know if this was said already, but my personal Bible at the very bottom, it says about the basket of summer fruit. It says, what seemed an innocent image of ready-to-eat fruit was actually a picture of impending punishment.
There
Israel
we go.
ready to accept its dues.
Yeah. So think about how this works. I'll explain that to you even further. The Bible says in Proverbs, you reap what you sow. Well, reaping and sowing is actually an agricultural action, right? Literally has to do with taking seeds, throwing it in the ground, and at the end of the harvest, you reap the seeds that you threw into the ground, provided that you attended the harvest, right? You were out in the field, watering it, keeping the insects out of it, adding the manure, all that kind of stuff. You reap, you sow. You sow, you reap, right? And you reap what you sow. Well, the Bible is good at using everyday actions and giving spiritual and moral meanings to it. So just like you reap what you sow in the natural, likewise, you reap what you sow in the supernatural and in the moral. If you do bad things, you reap bad things. If you do something evil, you reap negative consequences. If you do something good, you reap positive consequences, right? So this basket of ripe fruit looks good. And if you understood what it was like in the Northern Kingdom at the time that Amos was raised up as a prophet, everyone who were in positions of power were prospering. It was actually a pretty comfortable time, right? So they were probably all like, judgment, whatever, I'm doing pretty good. Have you seen my fat summer house? Look at my grain silo, got a lot of food there, right? So it looked like this beautiful basket of fruit, everything was good. But actually the fruit represented that the time of their sowing was over. And they have been sowing unrighteousness. And now they're going to reap the results of that unrighteousness in God's judgment. And he's going to bring it down upon them all at once. That's what it represents. So good. Yes, absolutely. Do you see anything else in there that seems like an image or a metaphor or a simile or some kind of figurative language?
Just thinking like the Nile.
Yeah. It's you literally using the word like for a simile, right? So it's not literally talking about the Nile. The Nile becomes an image of what it's going to be like. The Nile rises and it falls, rises and falls. So it's like unstable. You know, the ground is not even, right? So good. You guys are demonstrating to me that okay, so you get this. You know how to get into figurative language, identify analogies, do similes in the Bible. That's fantastic. Let's move on to the next one. Question 2. Describe the social position and economic practices of the people in 8:4-6. Where were they in the scale of society? And what were they doing?
Oppressing the poor.
Yeah. What point to something specifically?
Verse 4, trampling on the needy.
All right. Yeah, that's like so explicit. Exactly. Good. Here's something that if you go further down,
Cheat with dishonest scales.
Yes, dishonest scales. There it is. Yep. So these are moderately well-off people. They were the merchant class and the upper class, right? At least. Now, this is interesting. Describe the religious practices mentioned. Because they're not like godless atheists. They didn't deny that God existed. Look what the text says.
Oh, it talks about Sabbath
Yeah. So
and the songs of the temple.
there we go. They were doing their religious practices. They were religious people that went and observed the Sabbath. They stopped their business dealings on the Sabbath, right? They observed the new moon. The new moon was a festival, by the way. And so it was a religious festival. I think it had something to do with God as provider. But whatever it was specifically, it was a religious festival and they were observant. They observed the Sabbath, they observed the new moon festival, but what was their attitude that was expressed regarding their observance?
They just want to make money.
Yeah. But look at the question, when will the new moon harvest be over? When will it be over?
To end. Okay, so I thought the new moon, I didn't know that was a festival. I thought it
Yeah.
was just their like cycle for their agriculture.
Right, and that would be a part of it because a lot of their festivals that gained religious meaning were born out of their agricultural practices. They were very earthy people. Yeah. But I see, like, this reminds me of the story. I remember one time when I was going to church and my wife pointed out, you know, you never drive to church like when you're going to the movies. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And it's like, when you're driving to go to the movies, you're like super strategic and you like go fast, but not so fast that you're going to be pulled over by the cops, right? But just fast enough to not be pulled over the cops, but a little bit faster than everybody else. And you always know how to get there the fastest way because you don't want to miss the trailers at the movies, you know, and you want to get your popcorn and get all comfortable and that kind of stuff. But you don't drive like that when you're going to church, you know. Now it's different because I'm a priest at a church and, you know, I have to be there and set up and that kind of stuff. So my responsibilities are different. But back in the day, before I was ordained, you know, I went to church faithfully all the time. And mostly I like church, but sometimes I'd be sitting in the pews going, whew, can't wait to go get something to eat because I'm really hungry right now, Pastor. And I think you made your point, you know, regarding the preaching. No, you don't need to go into the second half hour of your sermon. That's cool. The first half hour was fun enough. So I would have those attitudes sometimes, still do wrestle with them a little bit. We're all growing, changing, maturing. But anyways, so God saw their devotion on the level of what they were practicing, but he also saw their heart and where their hearts were actually at. Their hearts were not really in honoring God through worship. They were just observing the festivals. For whatever reason, they were maintaining the cultural practice, but their hearts were really about making money. And because that's where their hearts were at, they abused justice. And that's what God was calling them out on, the oppression of the poor that you guys already pointed out.
They're like ancient
that?
Wall Street.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Ancient Wall Street, absolutely. Okay, so how's God pictured in this passage?
Attentive to what people are doing.
Yeah, in a way that makes you uncomfortable if you're not doing something good. Because those people will be like, what? I'm observing the Sabbath. What are you busting my chops for? Yeah, I could see you observing the Sabbath. And I could also see the condition of your heart while you're observing the Sabbath. And I could see what you do when the Sabbath is over during the work week, how you treat people. Yeah, he's very attentive. That's a good word for it. What else? Is there any other imagery that comes to mind?
Vengeance.
Yeah, exactly. You know, the way I receive that vengeance, the way I look at it is like, sick of it. You know, like, you've tried my patience. It's over. I'm sick of it. I'm sick of you all. I've been trying to get you to change. You're not changing. Now I'm spanking your butt, you know? So, yes, vengeance has come. How is God's vengeance, his judgment upon Israel, fitting? This might be a little challenging, but it's there. It's poetic justice is what I'm trying to say. It's ironically fitting.
Well, I mean, his judgment's going to, like, they're so used to wanting to make money and live well, he's going to kind of give them the opposite.
Yeah. Okay, so the land's going to be shaken. They're going to be deeply disturbed. They're going to experience a famine. So all their plenty will come to an end. But there's another detail in there in the midst of all that that's very fitting. And again, I know it's hard to pull out.
Well, it says they're gonna run and seek the word of the Lord, and they're not gonna find it.
There it is. So it's not just a famine of food and water. It is that, okay? But it's a famine of God's word. And the reason why it's fitting is because God is basically saying this: I'm speaking to you and you're not listening. I keep speaking to you and you don't listen. And by the way, in the Bible, to listen basically means to do. To listen means to obey. You prove that you're really listening to God by following through on what he said. So for God, even though you might hear him, if you don't obey, you're not listening. You see the distinction? So God's basically saying, I'm speaking to you and you're not listening. Therefore, why should I continue to speak to you if you're not going to listen? I'm going to be quiet. That's the ultimate judgment. So even though all that bad calamitous stuff fell upon them, like they did suffer drought, they did suffer a food famine, the worst of it from God's perspective, and Israel would come to feel this, is that God was not speaking to them any longer. And it was not long after the time of Amos that there were no prophets for centuries until Jesus hit the scene. It was a famine of God's word. God did not raise up prophets for Israel. And so they were kind of like, oh my God, we need to hear from the Lord. What's going on? So for this segment, let's wrap up with this. How is the social world of Amos? Let's just stick with like. How is it like our world?
We have people living in poverty while other people, are like exploiting everything. And I would say that a lot of people aren't following the Lord the way that he wants them to.
Yeah.
And like you said, like people go to church, but it's just something to do instead of going, to serve and worship and fellowship,
Yeah. And actually, I would say, I mean, it kind of works both ways. I think I want to be careful when I criticize the church. I mean, it's easy to criticize the church, right? Because the church is full of broken people like myself who are not perfect, who are working at our salvation. And by salvation, what I mean, becoming more like Christ. I'm not there yet, right? Hopefully I'm more generous and kind and giving and patient than I was 10 years ago, than I was 10 years before that and whatnot. But you can still find faults in the people of God for sure, right? So there is that. Some people use church for reasons other than going to worship God and follow him. They could use it as a means of social networking, probably in some pockets in our nation more than others. Like I bet you in the South, you could still network quite a bit more in church than you can in other places because church attendance is down, as far as national averages is concerned. Being a Christian or being a member of a church is not as common as it was like 30, 40, 50 years ago. So there's a change that's happening. But it doesn't mean that Americans aren't spiritual people, which is to say that a lot of people still espouse some kind of spirituality and some kind of values that go with that spirituality. And even though they're not going to church, all of us fall short of our ideals. So it's like, I like to point out, maybe this is my own personal bugaboo, if you will, but I like to point out that nobody is the perfect embodiment of their values. Nobody lives out their values perfectly, right? So and the reason why I point this out is a lot of times you hear people say, I don't want to go to church and hang out with the hypocrites. And I want to say, the hypocrites have left the building, my friend, they're out in the world. Everybody falls short of their values. So on some level, we're all hypocrites to some degree, In fact, the only way to really save yourself from hypocrisy is by acknowledging your brokenness and acknowledging that you fall short. And that's the thing right there. But anyways, that's my little soapbox. I'll put that aside for now. But yeah, in many ways, we're still dealing with a lot of similar issues. Religious people in positions of power who are not following through consistently on their ideals. And as a result of that, people are oppressed. People are broken, and We can see that in our culture now just as much as they saw it back in Israel in the day. All right, good. So now we kind of just took a leap into the contemporary world. How does the Bible continue to speak to us in the world that we live in? How is the Bible similar to the world back then? Then if you were really to analyze this, you would talk about how it's different. Well, we don't live in a monarchy, so we don't elect our king, and our king does not lead us in righteousness, right? So now we have to think about those differences. The people who we elect, are they expressive of who we are? Do we get what we deserve when we elect them? You know what I'm saying? No, just something to think about. We won't do that right now, though. Okay, it is now 7:20. I want to skip over prophecy in the New Testament because I think you're going to cover this online. Let's talk a little bit about wisdom literature. Let me see. I don't think we're going to do that. Let me jump right into this. Genres of wisdom. So you guys, I know you'll be looking at videos from the Bible Project. You're going to be looking at the Ecclesiastes video, and you're going to be looking at the Proverbs video, okay? Which is really cool because those two types of videos represent two types of wisdom literature. So in the Bible, wisdom is not just one monolithic genre. There are types of wisdom literature. I remember being a good Bible interpreter, a part of that is being able to identify the type of genre that you're engaging. What type of genre is this? I think I mentioned that during the first week when I talked about like movies and how there's rom-coms and horror, and they each have their own characteristics, right? That kind of stuff. Okay, so good. So there is a kind of literature called wisdom literature. That's the big umbrella term. But underneath on the umbrella term of wisdom literature, there's two basic types: conventional and speculative. Conventional wisdom is what you see in Proverbs, and speculative wisdom is what you see in Job, the story of Job, and the book of Ecclesiastes. And the way conventional wisdom works is this: it's how the world is supposed to work within a fairly clear cause and effect moral framework. See the top right there? A fairly clear cause and effect moral framework. I just quoted something from that genre. You reap what you sow, right? If you put evil out there, you get evil back. If you put good out there, you get good back. They generally offer rules and pithy sayings for happiness and well-being. Early to bed, early to rise, makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise, right? That's not the Bible, that's Benjamin Franklin. But it still works like that. Their insight is based upon observation, observing. Remember like the pictures of the men, the kind of intuitive versus like observing knowledge? It's kind of based upon that, observing the world and the patterns that you are able to discern by observing the world. They are insight based upon observations of general patterns of existence. The righteous prosper, the wicked come to ruin. And they work within a retribution principle. Again, that's reaping what you sow. Okay, now, speculative wisdom. Speculative wisdom challenges conventional wisdom by showing that the world does not always work the way conventional wisdom, Proverbs, implies. Because we know sometimes evil people seem to prosper and good people suffer horribly, particularly at the hands of abusers and evil people. And then the world's even more complex than that, because those people who are, we might call generally good, they're not lawbreakers, they're still sinners. They're not perfect. They still do bad things. And those people that we call lawbreakers or evil are capable of doing good. Like a couple of years ago, I was watching the first season of Narcos. I don't know if you're familiar with that series. It's a drama series about drug cartels. And the first one was about the Medellin drug cartel in Colombia back in the 80s under Pablo Escobar, right? And that guy, he was a wicked man. I mean, like he would just take a whole family out if they got in his way. But he was also considered a kind of Robin Hood kind of character because he actually funded a lot of like youth programs in Colombia. He renewed a lot of the cities with the money that he made through drugs, right? But he invested back in the community. So here's this man that I would say is largely evil that was doing a lot of good for the society that he was in, right? So all I'm trying to point out by saying that is life is not clear cut. Evil people always do only evil. Good people always do only good. We're kind of a mix. And where do you draw the line between, okay, now you're in the evil category and now you're in the good category? That's not an easy line to draw. How can you weigh someone's good deeds against their bad deeds, particularly since people can do good things for bad reasons, and sometimes people do bad things for good reasons? It's complex, right? And that's what speculative wisdom wants us to consider, the complexity of human existence, that things do not fall into our boxes very well. That's what speculative wisdom is about. So this kind of wisdom seeks insight beneath the surface of things, beneath the easy categories that we use to carve up and make sense of the world. It examines the complexities of human existence in a less than ideal world. And by the way, the whole world is less than ideal because according to Genesis 3, the world is fallen. It no longer perfectly expresses God's good design. It's subject to sin and death, which is corruption. And then what speculative wisdom focuses on is the inscrutable ways of God, right? And I just started watching this series called Evil. Yes, I, a pastor at a church, am watching this series called Evil. It's on CBS, right? But it's kind of cool because there's this guy in it that's an investigator for the Catholic Church, and he's on the road to becoming a priest, right? And I've only seen the first couple of episodes. And what they're trying to investigate is, are these supernatural phenomena really supernatural, or is there some kind of charlatanism, right? That's what he's doing. And the second episode, he's talking to this lady who's a psychologist who's kind of an agnostic, right? And she's asking him about prayer because she has a daughter that's like sick, very sick. And she said, look, if I believe that prayer really worked in a way that I can understand it, I would be praying more than any saint. I would be praying for my daughter day and night without sleeping to make sure that she got well. But I don't understand God's ways because I know people who've prayed and prayed and prayed and prayed and they still get sick or their loved ones die. And I know people who don't even think about God and they receive a miracle. So I don't understand God's ways, right? And this man, the main character in this show, he responded by saying, to me, it doesn't work that way because I think God being who he is, there's like designs within designs within designs that we do not understand. And that's as simple as it is. It's like, I'm not saying that God doesn't have a plan or that he doesn't have some kind of design or pattern to how he's managing things. It's just that he has designs within designs that are beyond our understanding. And in the meantime, I just do my best and pray, you know? And I kind of feel like, yeah, dude, that was good. And that was like CBS, you know? It wasn't from a pastor in a church. It was on late night television. Like, whoa, all right, good for you, CBS. Anyways, okay. Particularly focuses on the inscrutable ways of God. Let me see. Where are we at? 7:27. This is about 5 minutes. Let's look at this because this is not online. I'm going to try to bring this up for you guys. I have it queued on my, oh, come on now. There you are. Oh, I see why. First, let me get out of this. And bam. Okay. Now we can see one another. I'm going to do a new share. I'm going here. I think this one. Yeah, there we go. Oh, wait, let me do this. There's something about when I do this, share screen. There it is, share sound. That's the reason why it didn't work the last time I tried to do this. But I clicked the button that said share sound. Now let's see if I could get it to work. Tell me if you could hear this coming out of your own. Is it working?
Yeah.
All right, sweet.
There are 3 books in the Bible known as the wisdom literature: Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job. The first, Proverbs, showed us that God is wise and just.
Yeah, we learned that God has ordered the world so that it's fair. The righteous are rewarded, the wicked are punished. In other words, you get what you deserve.
But then we meet Ecclesiastes, who observes, people don't always get what they deserve.
Yeah, he said the world isn't always fair, that life is unpredictable and hard to comprehend, just like smoke.
And this makes you wonder, okay, well, is God wise and just?
Exactly. And so it's that question that is being explored in the final book of wisdom, Job.
All right, let's dive in.
So Job begins with a strange story that takes place up in the heavens, which are described something like a heavenly command center. So God is there with these angelic creatures called the sons of God, and they're all there reporting for duty.
And God points out this guy Job, his servant, showing how righteous and good he is.
And then one of these angelic creatures approaches. He's referred to in Hebrew as the Satan.
The Satan. Who is this?
Well, this word is actually a title, which literally means the one who is opposed. So out of this whole crew, he is the one questioning how God is running the world. And he proposes that Job might not actually love God, that he's only a good person because God rewards him. If God were to take away all of the good things he gave to Job, then we would see his true colors.
So he thinks Job is just working the system?
That's exactly right. Maybe he's obeying just to get what he wants.
So God agrees to this experiment and allows the Satan to inflict suffering on Job.
And Job loses everyone and everything that he cares about. It is devastating. And remember, he deserves none of this. God himself said so.
The remarkable thing is that in the midst of all this suffering, Job still praises God.
At least for chapters 1 and 2. But then in chapter 3, we find out how he's really feeling inside. He unleashes this poem that reveals this devastation. It's a long, elaborate curse on the day that he was born.
After this, some of Job's friends come to visit him to offer their help. And all of them are like, Job, you must have done something horribly wrong to deserve this. After all, we know God is just, and we know the world is ordered by God's justice and fairness, so you must be getting what you deserve.
And for the next 34 chapters, the friends and Job go back and forth in very dense Hebrew poetry. His friends keep speculating about why God might have sent such suffering, and they even start making up lists of hypothetical sins that Job must have committed. But after each accusation, Job defends his innocence.
And Job is innocent.
He is. He's also on an emotional roller coaster. At some moments, he's very confident that God is still wise and just.
Yeah, in other moments, he's doubting God's goodness.
He even comes to accuse God of being reckless, unfair, and corrupt. So by the end of the dialogues, Job demands that God come and explain himself in person, and God does so. He comes in the form of a great storm cloud.
Now, God doesn't give Job a direct answer. He doesn't tell Job about the conversation with the Satan.
Yeah, he does something very different. He takes Job on a virtual tour of the universe. He shows Job how grand the world is, and he asks him if he's even capable of running it or understanding it, just for a day. He shows Job how much detail there is in the world, things that we might see every day, but really don't understand at all. But God does. He knows it all intimately. He pays attention to the beauty and operations of the universe in ways that we haven't even imagined and in places that we will never see.
Then to conclude, God shows Job two wondrous beasts and brags about how great they are.
Yeah, they are dangerous. I mean, they would kill you without even thinking about it. And God says they're not evil. They're actually a part of his good world.
And then that's it. That's God's whole defense. It's kind of weird. I mean, what was this all about?
It seems to be this. From Job's point of view, it looks like God is not just. But God's perspective is infinitely bigger. He's dynamically interacting with a whole universe of complexity when he makes decisions. And this is what God calls his wisdom.
So Job asking God to defend himself is actually kind of absurd.
He couldn't comprehend this kind of complexity even if he wanted to.
So where does this leave us?
Well, it leaves Job in a place of humility. He never learned why he suffered, and yet he's able to live in peace and in the fear of the Lord.
But that's not where the book ends, because after this, God restores to Job double everything he had lost. And this, again, is surprising. I mean, is this a reward? Is that saying, congratulations, Job, pass this elaborate test? No, you know what? Just made the point that Job...
Oh, stopped. Hold on.
Losing everything was not a punishment, and so now getting it back isn't a reward.
So why does he get it back?
Well, apparently, God, in his wisdom, decided to give Job a gift. We don't know why. But what we do know is that Job is now the kind of person who, no matter what comes, good or bad, he can trust God's wisdom.
And that's the book of Job and the end of our wisdom series.
These biblical books of wisdom are amazing. Each one offers a unique perspective on the good life, and you need to hear all of them together as you learn to live with wisdom and in the fear of the Lord. Hey, you guys, thank you for watching this video from the Bible Project. You can find a lot more
Okay, good. We're going to stop there and stop share. We'll go back to again, normally when I'm in a 4-hour class, there's a longer assignment where we actually look at passages from Job and kind of process it together, how his friends respond and whatnot. We're not going to do that tonight in the time that we have. Instead, what I'd rather do is go to the final set of questions, and we're not even going to do all the questions. I just want to look at a couple of questions here. Wow, that slide got messed up. I'm gonna have to reformat that. But 6, are you satisfied with God's response to Job? So ideally, you were assigned to read some passages from Job at this point. You may or may not have. You got the video. The video gave you a good overview. By the way, the Bible Project also has another book on Job that gives you more of the literary structure that you could watch if you found this interesting. And I recommend you watch that one as well. But we got what we needed for the sake of this question. Knowing what you know about the story of Job, knowing what you know about the framing narrative, right? That there's this wager between God and the Satan about Job's righteousness and what's actually motivating Job. Knowing that although Job appears to be a good man, there was some stuff that surfaced in his heart, right? And as he was going through his ordeal, God confronted him, the whole issue of complexity and all that kind of stuff. And then you understand how the story resolved. Are you satisfied with God's response to Job? Let's begin with that. Yes or no? And defend it. If you say yes, tell me why. No, tell me why. And it's all welcome, by the way. I won't judge you. Or if I do, I'll keep it to myself.
I mean, how cool would it be if like we prayed to God and he just came down and gave us a huge like projection of how the universe works through his eyes? Like I'd be pretty down for that.
But would you really? I mean, I agree with you. There's a part of me that says that, right? But there's another part of me that's like, if we really, maybe my concern is if we really actually saw it for what it was, it might cause our head to explode. You know what I'm saying? Like it'd be such a download of information. We'd just be like, ah, you know. You're going to say, sorry.
Oh, no, I agree with you. Yeah, I mean, how many times have we prayed about something and, you know, our prayer is answered, but it's years down the line and we don't realize it until a decade later. And we can look back on it and say like, oh, okay, all the suffering that I felt years ago when I was praying about it every day, you know, and you can kind of see how it turns out later down the road. Or maybe we don't. Maybe it's part of God's plan and we don't ever get to see the plan unfold.
Yeah. Anyone else? Satisfied, not satisfied? Any kind of commentary about the story? Anything bother you? Anything you resonate with?
Well, like as a mother, if that happened to me, I'd be full of hate and I wouldn't, you know, like it was to prove a point that like if God did that to me it'd be he did all this just to prove a point.
Yeah,
and
no,
it's
exactly.
like those are my children, that's my kids, that's my husband that you took. So I can see like for Job to let it go. I know that being with God and him explaining it would change everything,
right?
But the fact that he had good and bad days, like I would just be in sorrow and just hate the world if that was, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So like, you know, reading it as a story, we're like, yay, the end, everything doubles, he's good. But just thinking about it, like if I was in his shoes, I would be traumatized. Yeah.
And rightly so. And let me say something, because a theological point came to mind when you said that, Lydia, pardon me. And mind you, when I wear a theologian's hat, it's not always the same thing as when I wear a pastor's hat. Like, so if somebody came into my office and they wanted to process the fact that they lost a loved one recently, what I'm going to share with you is not what I would say to them, because timing is everything, right? But it occurs to me that our children actually belong to God more than they belong to us, right? And I know it's hard for us to get our heads around that because they're from our DNA. You know what I'm saying? And if you're a mother, they literally came from your body. And it's hard to imagine anyone being closer than that, right? But I think God is trying to invite us in our imagination to imagine his being as being just that kind of being that's actually closer to us than we are to ourselves. And whatever love a mother might have for her children is still a pale comparison to the love that God has for them, no matter what they suffer, you know? And we imagine too often that God is above, looking at all these things unfold, the tragedy, and somehow he's not touched by it. But if we allow Jesus and the cross to say anything about how we understand God, we have to say that's a lie. God is touched by this, right? And so I don't know what that means for, you know, if you're the woman that's recently lost a child, I'm not going to say, you know, tut, tut, God's closer to, you know, I'm not going to say all that, right? But maybe when we get somewhere critical distance, these are the things we need to reflect upon, is how God is involved in all of this with us and how he's carrying this with us. And he's not just looking down upon us in all his wisdom, making these divine declarations. You will suffer this, you will prosper, now you will prosper, now you will. He's not doing that, you know. I don't know exactly how he's doing it, honestly. But Job challenges that idea in some ways. Anyone else? So you're all totally cool with Job. Yeah, I get it, man. Job, man.
No, I'm more on Lydia's side. Like, as a mother, that was just, and then the fact that at the end it's like, oh, but everything doubled. It's like, yeah, my kids didn't come back, so
Yeah.
that doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It's just,
Right. It's like, it's not the same kids. I mean,
yeah,
these new kids, thank you. I love them too, but I lost them. They're unique, irreplaceable, right?
and I understand living, you have to have faith and understand all of that, but yeah, it's just what it
I'm just
is.
thinking, like, if it really happened to me, like how I would handle it. Because everyone could say I would handle it fine. I know it's all God's way. That's not how I would handle it. Like, you know what I mean?
No. Yeah.
So honestly now, like and this is why I'm so like back and forth. I'm a horrible, like Catholic person. Because I go back and forth, I always feel like those that truly believe and have faith, so much bad things happen to them. And I always, like, when I pray, I'll tell God, remember, I'm not strong. Like, please just remember, I can't do it.
Yeah. That's funny. It's like, you know, God, I don't want to get too close to you because I see how you treat the people that get really close to you. So I'll just maintain a comfortable distance. You know, like you and I were cousins, you know, I want to be in the family, but I don't want to be like right next to you. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, I totally get it.
Well, how I
get
see
it.
that is I feel like when we get closer to God, that's when the devil starts throwing stuff at us because he doesn't want us close to God. So that's
Right.
how I look at it.
So then what's the value of getting close to God if we're just going to face the devil's wrath? Why would we do it? That leads us into the next question. What is the nature of wisdom in Job? What does wisdom actually mean? I understand everything. Is that what it means?
I think it means just taking what you have around you and trying your best to understand it and just live your life day to day and not like Job still lived, right? His life went on. And so I think that's what wisdom is kind of just picking yourself up and continuing and learning from your mistakes. Or, well, I mean, he didn't do anything wrong, but, you know, just learning about life and trying to live it the best that you can.
I think he also learned that at the end of the day, nothing is his. Like, he learned God can take anything. As much as he gives you, he can take also. It's nothing's permanent, nothing's yours.
Right. Anybody else? What is the nature of wisdom in Job? This is good.
Well, at the end, they were just like the ultimate thing is trust God's wisdom. So we're not supposed to think of like human wise, like human knowledge or anything like that, but like God's wisdom.
Nice. You know what? Let me give a commentary on what you just said, Lydia, and then we'll transition to like the last 10 minutes. I'll talk a little bit about the paper, the final paper, and then we'll wrap up. But taking what you just said about trusting God, when I was a young man, and I was the kind of person that was raised in the church, I was raised in the Presbyterian church. I remember Sunday school and the flannel graphs with the felt Jesus and the stories that the Sunday school teacher would teach, you know, and I remember being in the choir and going through catechism and all that kind of stuff. And then I kind of had a walking away experience in my teen years, you know. So for me, it was like, you know, drugs and rock and roll. And then had an awakening experience around 18. And I can't quite describe it, just like, but all of a sudden God mattered to me. And I remember at that time thinking, you know, coming across these passages, for the just shall live by faith, for by grace are you saved by faith, right? Salvation is by grace. And I remember thinking grace and faith, that seems so easy. Like, oh, it's so easy. I'm glad I don't have to earn my salvation. I'm glad I don't have to be a perfect person to get to heaven. I'm glad I don't have to perfectly keep the law. Grace and faith. Thank God for Jesus in the New Testament. You know what I'm saying? That's how I take that, right? But in the intervening years, a few decades now, since I was a young man, I come to realize that faith is not so easy, right? That really trusting God is not so easy. That really trusting, and I know this sounds crazy because I'm a teacher and I'm a pastor, right? But I know my heart, and really trusting God. And I could say, God is good. God is sovereign. God sent his son to die for us. What better expression of goodness and self-offering can I get than that? And still, in my heart, there's that self-protective, self-reflective, not reflective, self-reflexive, protective self that you know, kind of like wants to take control of the reins and make sure I secure my peace and my people, that they don't get hurt, and not really trust God. And I think I've learned that even though grace through faith sounds like an easy thing, faith is not. Really learning to trust God, that's harder than I think we realize, is what it comes down to, you know? And so you were talking about trusting God's wisdom. Yes, but it's not easy to just trust God's wisdom. And in fact, I think on some level, that is a work of the Spirit. That is a kind of miracle in and of itself, given the complexity of the world around us and how confusing and dark and how often we suffer, you know, and some of us more than others, and we don't know why, you know, but somehow wisdom is learning to make the right kind of peace, not just peace like a stoic, like, oh, whatever, you know, not that kind of peace, making the right kind of peace with the suffering and the complexity and the limitations of our understanding, making the right kind of peace in faith. That's where wisdom is born. And you meet people who really embody that, you know? So anyways, any last words before I transition to the last thing? Okay. Let me see. I know I brought up my, here, I need to pull this out of the way. Hold on. And syllabus, bam. Y'all can see the syllabus? Good. Let me go to the end of our syllabus. Oh, by the way, these things will help you think through the kind of stuff I want you to think about when you're preparing your essay, the signature assignment. This historical world worksheet, the literary world worksheet, and the contemporary world worksheet are forcing you to engage the kind of questions I want you to think about as you are putting this essay together. It's not that I want you to incorporate your responses from these worksheets into your essay. I don't want you to do that. Unless it really, really, really does work, then fine. But often students try to cram their questions, their responses to these questions in their essay, and it's just awkward. I'm just trying to get you to think in depth about it. That's what the purpose of these worksheets are, okay? But let's get to the signature assignment. That's contemporary world, worth and status. Yeah, there we go. All right. So you'll notice in here what's actually going on is you have the Bible's department instructions, the signature assignment for biblical perspectives, 5 to 7 page paper, where you're supposed to get the meaning of the biblical text. Hold on, I need to do something here. There we go. You're supposed to address the meaning of the book of Philemon by using the skills gained in this course. You should demonstrate your awareness of literary dynamics of the text as well as the historical background of Philemon. You only need to draw upon course text and materials, so you don't have to do extra research. You could if you want to, but you don't have to. Keep that in mind. So the paper should start with a clear thesis statement, and you could even use these words, but finish it out with your own, right? You could start your thesis statement with, the book of Philemon is about. That's a good thing to do, right? Then you tell me what you think the book of Philemon is about. That's going to make it easy for me to identify your thesis statement. And 20% of your grade is having a good introduction and clear thesis statement, 20% of your grade. So you want to get that down. So the Bible department says the paper should include a thesis statement. This is my elaboration in italics. Remember that a good thesis statement is not just a declaration of a key topic or theme. So it's not enough to say the book of Philemon is about slavery. That's a theme in the book. That's a topic in the book, right? But that's not really what the book is about. The book is about what is Paul saying about slavery. And what Paul has to say about slavery is not explicit, it's implied. So that's what you're trying to discern. What is Paul basically saying about slavery implied in this letter, as implied in this letter? So I've given you the domain. You want to say something about slavery, I would say that.
Can you repeat that one more time? Sorry.
Sure. So regarding the thesis statement, I don't want you to just say the book of Philemon is about slavery. That's just declaring a theme or a topic. You have to be more specific, more complex, more focused. What is Paul saying about slavery? That's going to be your thesis statement. And by the way, this is the challenge. He doesn't say anything explicit about slavery. It's implied in what he does say. That's what you're trying to tease out. What's the implications regarding Paul's attitude about slavery in what he does say? That's what you're trying to tease out, what's implied in what he says. So for example, I give you an example here. Looking at the Gospel of John, for example, one could say that a key theme is the life of God breaking into the world. So somebody could write a thesis statement about the Gospel of John that says the Gospel of John is about the life of God breaking into the world, right? But that would not be enough if they stopped there. They need to elaborate on it. They need to develop it. So look how I develop it. The book of John is about the life of God breaking into the world through the person and work of Jesus the Messiah, which culminates in his work on the cross. Do you see how I took the basic idea and I added more details to it, elaborated upon it, focused it more? That's what you need to do. So I'm already telling you that the book of Philemon has something to do with slavery in the ancient world, okay? Paul is saying, he's revealing his attitude about slavery and about issues related to status in Greco-Roman society, which is the society that the church was birthed in, right? And it's not explicit, it's implied in all that he says in that letter. That's what I want you to tease out. So that when you say the book of Philemon is about, Paul's convictions that slavery is or whatever it is that you come to, that, it's going to look like that. Your thesis statement's going to look something like that. So that's 20% of your grade, getting a good thesis statement in the context of a good introduction. The body of the paper. This is your strategy. The Bible department says this, pardon me. The body of the paper should demonstrate a recognizable structure. That's always the case of any paper you write. That articulates why the thesis is viable. In other words, why we should accept the thesis that you're offering as the way to understand the book. The body of the paper may take the form of a section by section or verse by verse analysis that focuses on the literary dimension and draws upon the historical background when applicable. That's good. Focus on the literary and only draw in insights from the historical background information if it helps us better understand what's happening in the literary dimension of the text. You don't have to give me a bunch of historical information if that information, that historical information, is not helping me better understand what's happening in the text. You only draw in historical information to explain what's happening in the text. Keep that in mind. Otherwise, what you're doing is you're giving me superfluous historical information that's not really supporting your thesis. All right. Does that relationship kind of make sense? So if you said like Caesar had a son that he killed, well, that's historically true, and that happened at that time that Paul was writing, right? But what is that? How does that shed light on what's happening in the book? You know what I'm saying? You need to find relevant historical information and show me how it illumines what is happening in the text. That's the kind of historical information you want to find.
So like what role does slavery play in the Roman?
Yeah. Now, if you explain the system of slavery and what kind of maybe slave Philemon was, and if that sheds light on the relationship between Philemon and Onesimus, I'm sorry, it's Onesimus that was a slave. Philemon is the master. If you were to use the system of slavery in the Greco-Roman world to help us understand the relationship between Onesimus and Philemon, then you're providing historical information that's relevant to the text. Good job, Lydia. Yeah. So yeah, keep that in mind. Do that kind of research. Fantastic. And in fact, I think I prompt you to do a little bit of that in one of those historical world worksheets, the world worksheets. Yeah, the world worksheets. I think I prompt you to consider that. So good.
Yeah, it was in this week's worksheet, the
Good.
historical one.
Yes, good. Okay, fantastic. Good. Okay, so since this assignment is about interpreting the text, the main focus should be on the literary world. So that's your focus, which is most accessible because it's right there. Thank God, this is only a one-page book, by the way. Hallelujah. As it is how the story takes shape in your imagination to the literary qualities the author uses to convey the meaning of the text. So it's not really a story, it's a letter. This book, Philemon, is really a letter that Paul, an apostle, is writing to a convert named Philemon, who happens to be a slave owner of a runaway slave named Onesimus. And so you don't use the same literary forms of analysis that you would when you're analyzing a story, right? You're not necessarily like, who's the narrator? It's not really that kind of thing, right? It's a letter as opposed to a story. There is an implied story. The implied story is about the runaway slave, right? But all those details are not filled in for you. So really what you're focusing on is Paul is trying to get Philemon to do something. Pay attention to that. Let me say that again. Through this letter, Paul is trying to get Philemon to do something. What techniques does he use in the letter to persuade, to cajole, to incline Philemon to do what he wants him to do? That's the bulk of your analysis. Regarding the historical world, I just mentioned this. You can draw upon this to help you deepen your or elaborate your understanding of what's going on in the text. So for example, if the story mentions kingship, you can refer to historical works that helps you understand what kingship typically looked like in that culture beyond what the text expresses. I should have added, as long as it's helping us understand something in the text itself. Just like you said about slavery, Lydia, that's what you want to do. Okay, so the conclusion. The conclusion should restate the thesis kind of in a summary fashion, but don't stop there. That's like C-level conclusion, maybe a B-level conclusion, right? If you just recap, that to me, out of 100 points, I'm going to give you 70, maybe 75, maybe 80 if it was well written. But you're not going to get into the 80, 85, 90, 95, 100 points for your conclusion if that's all you're doing. In order, you need to go beyond that. So this is what you need to do. The conclusion is also a place for reflection on the implications of Philemon for your life and work. What's at stake for us, the reader? Why does Philemon matter to us? Because this thing, after all, was written 2,000 years ago. Why should I care? But if you could show me why I should care somehow in your conclusion, now you're moving towards significance. That's good. So the conclusion is not just a summary, but also a time to establish the significance of your analysis for you and the reader who live in the contemporary world. In doing this, you want to keep in mind the differences between the culture you live in and the culture of the textual world. You want to be able to navigate that with integrity. And in acknowledging these differences, you should identify what carries over from that world to our world and why it carries over. In short, the question you are addressing is, how can we translate the message from there to here? If you do that well, that's how you get more points. So that's the basics. Next week, what we'll try to do is I want to create time for us to discuss it. So read the book of Philemon, watch the video from the Bible Project, then read it again. And if you have time, read it again. It's 1 page, it's short. And then come with questions and we'll process this together, okay? And then we can pick one another's brains to better understand it. And then hopefully you can carry that with you into your writing. Any questions? Straight up 8. On the nose, on the hour. I'm ready to wrap it up. If you don't have any questions, I'm going to stop share and let it go. That's it. God bless you all. Have a good night.
Night.
Good night. Thank you.
You're welcome.